We are live, but I think the little live.
So we're on the top right.
Oh,
It's moved.
We are live.
All right, good afternoon and welcome to the House Environment Committee. This afternoon, we are going to continue taking testimony on H 230, an act relating to the management of fish and wildlife, and we welcome Mary White from the Farm Bureau.
Hi,
Welcome.
representatives. Thank you for having me. This is actually my first time in this committee, so just wanted to take the time to introduce myself. My name is Mary White. I currently sit as the first vice president for the Vermont Farm Bureau. My husband and I have a small dairy farm here in Orange County, Vermont. We are the fifth generation here. Our family has been farming this land for 125 years. So we've seen a lot of wildlife behavior changes and just in designation where they're field crops and such. And I also work as a crop insurance agent, so happy to provide any insight from that standpoint as it pertains to the language in this bill. So if we don't have any specific questions to start, I'm just going to dive into a little bit of the language that I see here and the experience that I have in the field as well.
Great.
So as I stated, did you want me to continue or did we have any questions right off?
No, I think we would love to hear we invited you to tell us what you thought about in particular, the crop damage section.
Okay, absolutely, yes. So from our standpoint, as a small dairy farm, our primarily crop that we grow that would be substantially damaged by any type of wildlife would be our corn silage. And you know, that is not included as part of this bill, so I don't want to focus on it too much, but we have seen an increase of wildlife behavior recently, especially within the last 10 years of black bears being more aggressive towards crops. We try to rotate our corn as much as we can. We are a very small farm, so some of our fields are 3 acres, some are 20 acres, and we really try to utilize crop rotation, no-till planting, all the things to try to help deter, but we always estimate a 10-acre loss damage on our small farm every year, which equates to over $10,000, so $1,000 in acres of direct loss that we've now had to kind of play into our own risk management to equate for every single year due to black bears. But specifically towards this bill, I support the language, and I say this because this is really the only language that we have in law to support farmers for damages from wildlife to crops. The House Agriculture Committee a few years ago did look at a standalone bill that would have maybe attributed to deleting this language, but that bill, I believe, sat on the wall and did not go to the floor. So really the damages suffered on this relate to deer, and specifically the incidences that we see deer from as a farm perspective is really forages. So we're talking about crops that people plant, whether they're vegetables. When hemp was a huge trend here, 2020 and 2021, there was a huge concern with hemp crops and deer getting into those crops. So from an insurance standpoint, there is no insurance for damage if a deer comes and eats a producer's entire vegetable crop. There would be no insurance. So that farmer would lose that significant source of income. And with some of these crops, they might not have time to replant depending on the time of year. They might lose their peak harvest. It might be early in the harvest and they have time, but it's really hard for a farmer to prepare for that type of loss when our growing season is so short. As far as damage from bears on wildlife, really the major impacts we see are with beehives and poultry. So people with free range chickens, beehives that may be pollinating apple field trees or something in that nature. And those seem to be isolated attacks from, you know, those animals being in that area. Black bears usually, I really haven't experienced black bears attacking cattle or things like that. That's more coy dogs, I would say, that we've experienced. So when it comes to insurance on that end of things, you can insure your beehive for attacks on wildlife, your chickens as well. But the deductible most of the time doesn't meet the loss. So the producer is still having to recuperate that loss on their own if that insurance deductible is maybe higher than the loss itself. So this program, this language in this bill has been helpful for a lot of small producers. You know, we don't have a lot of huge apiaries here in Vermont. These are people with a couple beehives that are probably diverse farms that have vegetables as well and other crops, but losing one part of a diverse operation can be detrimental to a small farm just because the income is focused and limited on each individual crop. And then just going forward a little bit more, this does help Fish and Wildlife in the language that it requires the land not to be posted to allow recreation, to allow hunting in that instance. But I do understand the concerns from Fish and Wildlife that their department is probably not set up to have the funds available to directly pay for some of these damages because they are a different sector, right? We're talking about Fish and Wildlife versus farming. So where is that pool of money coming from, and would it be more appropriate somewhere else? I don't know the answer to that. But I think this is very important to farmers, and I would be very hesitant to delete this language. I do think it could use some reworking to make it work better for farms today and the different exposures we see, but I would be hesitant to delete it altogether.
Thanks for your testimony. We did get a list of, well, I guess I'm curious. So have you personally applied for a crop damage loss with the Fish and Wildlife Department?
We have not. Like I said, typically our black bear loss is related in corn crops, not with deer. So that wouldn't be covered under this language specifically. I do know a lot of, like I said, smaller diversified farms that have come forward with claims for vegetables as well as beehives.
This is exclusive to bears. Okay, and then can you explain a little bit about how crop insurance works? And I mean, it seemed like they gave us a list of people who have put in claims over the past, well, from 2022 to 2024.
Okay.
There were only 5 claims, and they have quite a range in their value on them. One of them is quite high, and actually it does say by deer, so I think deer is covered. I mean, by bear. Bear and deer. Yeah, because some of these are from bear and some are by deer, and these are the payments that Fish and Wildlife has made to people. So they cover both.
Okay, yeah. The way I read the black bear language, it seemed to be specific to
yeah,
livestock,
I can see
almost.
Right. But then the crop damage amounts range quite dramatically from $1,600 to $150,000.
Okay.
So since you are familiar with how regular crop insurance is, would you just give us a little primer on that?
Absolutely. So traditional crop insurance is run through the Risk Management Agency. It's a USDA program. And the crops that are eligible for your standard policies in Vermont are going to be apples, corn, soybeans, really your standard crops. It's not going to get into anything that you would plant as far as vegetables or other fruits. Apples are really traditional to Vermont, so those are an insurable crop because that crop production history is behind it. So the way that it works is a farm unit is viewed as not just one field, but entire farm premise. So let's take our home farm, for example. We have 72 acres of tillable land here at our home farm, but our fields range from 20 acres to 3 acres just due to the Vermont landscape. We've got a lot of forest land that runs behind our fields to the river. There's a lot of hedges that have separated some of the fields just for wind barriers and such. So we have a lot of smaller fields. And if there was a loss on our farm. It's viewed as the 72 acres as a whole is viewed as one unit. So to have a 50% loss, that's a significant amount of damage for a crop insurance policy to pay out due to the large number of acres. If it was just on that 1 3-acre field and we suffered damage there, that would be more obtainable for an insurance policy, you know, to meet that deductible per acre loss. But since it's viewing it as a farm, as one unit, that's where producers really struggle with some of these damages, because the bears and other wildlife, they target one area. You know, if the bear knows there's corn in this one field, it's probably going to stay in that field if, you know, there's enough food there for the bear to sustain. It's not going to travel to this other field on the other side of the farm when it has significant feed right in front of it. And on the apple side, usually it's apples that have fallen. You know, we don't really get a lot of claims from black bear damage in apples. That's more deer, I guess. It would mainly be apples fallen that have already fallen, and you would think that that's not a prime harvest opportunity anyway, so we don't see a whole lot of losses on that end.
Okay. Do members have questions? Representative Austin and then North.
Yeah, hi, thank you. I'm just wondering across the country, like what kind of mechanisms do farmers use that is successful in protecting their crops, or are there any?
Yeah, so right here in our home state for Vermont, it's really we utilize hound hunters, and we have some very professional sportsmen that will come every year and utilize dogs. That's been our best risk management tool that we have right now, along with crop rotation, like I said. But we've seen the bears have somewhat figured out the pattern, it seems. But those are two that really hit home. And like I said, for the hemp crops, it was, you know, people decided to put up fencing around. So sometimes if you see a beehive, people will put up fencing, electric fences around the beehives, just again, as a first front of risk management for them. But I have seen those fences torn down because the bears are so motivated to get to the bees. So from a larger standpoint, I guess across the country, I couldn't speak too well to that, but those are the main ones I see that people have tried in Vermont. And again, there's no perfect. Wildlife are hard to predict sometimes. Behavior changes once they adapt to something. I wouldn't suggest fencing in larger fields because that could cause harm to other wildlife as well, and would be very hard for a farmer to work around. So, but something like a beehive, I know people have tried fencing there. You know, some people fence in their gardens as well. You talk about deer fencing. It's a common practice for, again, just to provide that first line of defense. But if an animal is motivated enough, the fence is only a barrier.
Thank you.
Representative North.
Yes, thank you for your presentation here this morning. Very helpful. But this afternoon, I guess it's afternoon. Section 11, where you were suggesting that maybe we shouldn't delete it. What would you propose to change? The reason why I ask is that my recollection from the Department of Fish and Wildlife is the problem they were trying to solve with that particular section is that since there were no limits on the number of loss applications that were allowed to be submitted, there were just a small handful who were kind of seen as abusing the system, submitting multiple small claims that DFW was having to continue to process. So what would your thoughts on suggested changing be?
Yeah, so I think that I think this policy, I don't know exactly when it was written, to just try to put a time frame on it and how agriculture has changed since then. But I would like to see, you know, that might be something that's beneficial, a limit of applications per farm. Or for me, it's always from an insurance side of things and a business side of things. It's always, what are you doing to prevent future losses of this type? You know, like to their point, if something keeps happening and happening and happening, are we trying to prevent it at all, or are we just letting this happen? So, you know, risk management is, insurance is a transfer tool. So we're just transferring that risk somewhere else. But there are things, you know, like we suggested, like fences or crop rotation, or what are we doing to actively, try to deter this from continuing to happen if someone it does have a loss. I don't know if there's any language like that might fit into this. I don't think crop insurance should be a requirement because it really doesn't apply. That's more for your larger risks and perils of, wind, hail, drought, excessive rains, things like that, flood. So wildlife really isn't on a heavy hitter. It's not why someone signs up for crop insurance. So I don't think crop insurance should be a component, but I would think that maybe some sort of risk management aspect for applicants would be a reasonable compromise.
Let's have a limit in it, Rob, of
Well,
5,000.
Limit of financial limit, but what DFW is saying is it's a small number, so they would submit another application and another application and another
Right.
application.
So how do we stop that reputation? How does that farmer say, okay, I did my due diligence, so to speak, to try to prevent this from happening again? And if it's justifiable that they tried, maybe there's some language there.
No, you're not understanding. This farm in 1 year.
Yeah.
How do they get that if there's a $5,000 limit?
per day.
Right. That's what I was going to question too. Maybe that's the loss they submitted. They said, this is my actual crop damage, and they only got the 5,000 limit. I'm not sure. That's a good question to clarify, because that one number you said was significantly higher than 5,000.
Yes, it is. There's something, we'll find out more. There's more to the story. Yeah.
Right, per year.
Yeah, and I think the 5,000 is, focused on maybe those smaller farm incidences I was talking about that don't meet those insurance deductibles, in a sense of a beehive or, the farmer's crop of vegetables, because you would think a farmer would notice the damage, significant of that value. For vegetables, for instance, you're usually there this time of year when your crops are planted every day. So it'd be a small time period for that damage to occur, maybe overnight, something like that. You would see the damage the next day. When it comes to a cornfield, those fields are left mostly unattended. We don't really monitor our cornfields, and some of them are backed by woods, so we don't travel them often. So that's where I see a significant more dollar damage on that side of things than I would think on a smaller produce farm. So I do think this language is helpful for those types of farms.
Representative Chapin.
Thanks for your testimony, Mary. I guess as I read this provision in detail, it seems clearly to be driven, from what I can tell, as an incentive for farmers not to post their land to hunting, versus as a way to support farmers from crop damage. Because if it was about just risk mitigation, as you're pointing out, it would be more widely available, and it would be include the risk management side of things. Can you speak to anything about how important the role of this kind of a tool in trying to influence farmers as to whether or not to post their land?
Absolutely, yes. So we struggle with this, and it's something that's new for us. Going back even when we were growing up in the 90s and such, people didn't think much about posting their land. Either it was posted or it wasn't. Hunters were very respectful, and it was just a different time. And now we're seeing, just on our farm specifically, just for an example, that we've struggled with the concepts of, okay, if we post our land and don't reserve the hunting rights, that doesn't mean no one can hunt there. If we, as a farm owner, decide, because we have so much land, to post our land, we're really just asking people to come ask permission. So we're still allowing hunting, and we absolutely support hunting as a family. It's a tradition for us, but we just want people to know who's on our land and not have it just be a free-for-all, in a sense, because it has been abused in the past. So it's something we do struggle with, is that we have posted our land in the past just because that we wanted to know who was on our land and who was hunting it, especially, in an instance where younger people are getting involved. We have young children as well. So it is something we've struggled with. We didn't think of that would deter us from programs like this. If this was a significant program that would impact my operation, then I absolutely would have to think of that. if this was something that would support a crop damage. But like you said, I think you said it exactly how it was meant to be written. It's to incentivize farmers to not post their land versus compensating us for crop loss.
Thanks.
Representative Pritchard.
Do you find that is the most effective tool that you have been able to use as far as helping you with the crop damage concerns that you have? Has it been the houndsmen, the hounds folks that come in?
Absolutely. Yes. We've had a group of people, local people that have done it for generations almost. And they're very professional, and we're very happy with their work.
If they weren't available, how would you deal with that?
Honestly, we would lose more corn. It's like I said, we're already losing almost a 10% loss every single year just due to bear damage alone. And we plant an additional 10 acres now to account for that loss. And that equates to $10,000 for us that we know we're going to lose. So we would really have to think about other strategies. And the thing is, we're busy. We don't have that time to invest in the early seasons. It overlaps with cropping season for us for our third cut of hay. So, we're not able as farmers to be out there to be in the early seasons for black bear. We could incentivize, ask people as well to come hunt, but the hounds do such a better management job than just having people out there going to hunt, because the hounds aren't necessarily, just taking a bear. They're working on animal behavior as well to move bear. It doesn't always end in the decease of that animal.
Do the other farmers that do they utilize the same method?
Absolutely. Yes. It's a very popular tool right now for generations, really, that a lot of farmers use, dairy farmers specifically, with a lot of corn ground.
Thank you.
Can you remind us what town you're in?
Corinne?
Thank you. Further questions? Representative Labor.
Thank you. Mary, is all the blame on the bear, or do you have some very aggressive raccoons?
Raccoons are they can be feisty, yes. But no, the significant amount of damage that we'll see a little bit of raccoon damage, maybe, along the edge of a field. But I could share some aerial maps to show you the significance. When a bear travels into the field, they make what's called a bear circle. And if you look at an aerial view of some of our fields, even on Google Maps, you'll see that they just come into the field and make this large circle. What they do is they eat it and they roll around in it, and they almost get intoxicated by it. So they have a ball in there, and it's not all ingested. Again, a lot of it's them knocking it over and just rolling around in it. And they'll just see large circles that are specific due to bear behavior. But yes, raccoons are a small problem, but they are a problem.
Thank you.
Yeah, and just on the bear behavior, like I said, we've farmed this land a long time, and my husband's grandfather lived here 98 years. And he was a great testament to knowing the difference and what's happened with the wildlife population. And he's grown corn for 50 something of those years. And when he first started, he said you would rarely see a bear in this part of Vermont, rarely. And even in the 80s, 90s, it was very uncommon to see a bear. But over the last 10 years, the significant increase, I don't know if it's the bear population or if it's migration. That's a good question for Fish and Wildlife, but we see 10 different bear every season. So the wildlife patterns have changed, and I don't think this language has changed along with it, I guess, would be my point.
All right.
Thank you.
Thanks for your testimony, and thanks for joining us on short notice today.
Absolutely happy to be here, and look forward to you all continuing the conversation.
Right. All right.
Thanks.
Members, we are going to shift gears. I think we have our next witness in the room. This is Chris Kleza. Right, we're going to shift gears and talk about, we're doing a bill introduction of a bill that I have introduced, H 276. It is an act relating to the designation of state wildlands. And just briefly, it builds on Act 59 and essentially I don't think it's a surprise, but in one of the working groups in the inventory called for looking at how state lands would be utilized to meet our ecological reserve category of the 3 conservation categories that we defined in the bill. Ecological reserve is sort of the USGS's GAP 1 type of conservation lands, essentially wildlands, unmanaged lands. And this bill is an attempt to begin the conversation around what that could look like on our state lands. It was worked on by stakeholders, including Standing Trees, who just came into the room by way of Zach Porter. And anyway, so this is a place for us to look at the idea of how state lands could be used to meet the goals of ecological reserves. I think for me, I'm really interested in this topic because we've learned a lot in this session and in previous sessions about the importance of wildlands. A lot of these state lands are also our headwater lands. They're our steepest lands. And they, to me, are a logical starting place for where we could begin to meet the goals established in the bill for ecological reserve areas. This bill does begin to call out significant natural communities on certain state-owned lands. So it goes beyond sort of defining a process of how we would establish state wildlands, although it does talk about a process going forward for how that could occur. But it also does call out significant natural communities that are intact today on state lands as, again, another place to start the conversation about where we would begin to designate ecological reserve areas. I don't want to go on too long, but does anyone have any questions for me? Representative Austin?
Yeah, just, you know, I'm always now asking myself, because I don't know, you know, how does our housing needs fit into this? And I'm assuming these lands would not be used for development. Is that?
I would say no, that's not why they belong to the state of Vermont.
Okay, so that
These are lands
they're
that,
off. They're off.
these are, primarily in state parks, wildlife management areas, places that are acquired by the state for
Right,
recreation or ecological reserves.
yeah. I just see how things can change and, so just want to get a sense of if that, you know, if that would be possible in 10, 20, 30 years. You're looking ahead.
Yeah, I mean, these are state parks and lands in
Yeah.
remote areas. These are not places that we think of as, they don't have our downtowns or our village centers even in them.
Okay,
They're already in public land ownership. And I guess putting Vermont in context a little bit, and when I think about this, we've heard this in this committee, this session already, but the Adirondacks, state lands in the Adirondacks are managed, I think, in their entirely as wildlands. And our neighbors to the east, New Hampshire, and they have been for about 100 years. So when you hike in the Adirondacks, you get a real sense of what a rewilded, if you will. I mean, they were also heavily logged, but the state acquired them and chose to put them into a wild forest category when they acquired them. So you get a real sense for what those old forests feel like. Again, in New Hampshire, there's significantly more wilderness areas that are on federal land. And in Vermont, our lands that are managed wildly right now are primarily in the Green Mountain National Forest, but they are a very small fraction of those lands. We are outstanding in our field in having the least amount of wildlands I believe even less than Maine. Maine has Baxter State Park and significant wild areas set aside. So this really is about kind of catching up and helping meet that goal that's in Vermont conservation design of 9 to 10% old wild forest. And I know some folks look at this and they say, well, that kind of we'll have more wild lands in our Green Mountain biophysical regions. But I guess I would say that that's also where we have more conserved land. And in some ways, those are some of our most vulnerable areas. They're steep slopes, they're high elevation streams, and it's also where we've done the most conservation work.
So is this just an additional layer of protection? Is this being more specific about the protection? I mean, if they're already protected.
Right. Well, it would keep them in a wild state as opposed to a managed forest state.
Gotcha. Thank you.
With that, we have Chris Kleiza joining us via Zoom. Yeah, he is a Middlebury College professor of political science and environmental studies and has some thoughts on this bill. Welcome, Chris Kleiza.
Thanks very much. Thank you, everybody, for inviting me to testify. I am, as Chair Sheldon just mentioned, my name is Chris Kleiza. I'm Stafford Professor in Public Policy and Professor of Political Science and Environmental Studies at Middlebury. In 2001, I edited a book titled Wilderness Comes Home, Rewilding the Northeast, that focused on this very topic, wildlands and wilderness in the Northeast. And the book sought to survey the state of wilderness and wildlands in the Northeast, to provide an Eastern voice to the wilderness conversation, which typically centered in the Western US when you think of places like Yellowstone and Yosemite, and more to today's point, to present a model for developing a wilderness and wildland system in the Northeast moving forward. In terms of thinking about wildlands in Vermont and the Northeast, there are three central characteristics to think about. And one is this land will be recovered and restored rather than pristine, which is something people often get hung up on. It's also going to be a mix of public and private lands. We're, again, focused today on public lands, but there are folks working to protect private lands as wilderness as well. And importantly, these wildlands are going to be situated in a landscape of sustainably managed farmland and forest land. Again, we're not talking here about kind of preserving much of the state, but rather a significant, a meaningful but significant percentage of the state. In the 25 years since the book came out, there have been some real positive developments in Vermont on wilderness, wildlands, ecological reserves. More wilderness has been designated on the Green Mountain National Forest in 2006, bringing that total to about 100,000 acres. The Northeast Wilderness Trust, a land trust based in Montpelier, just a few blocks from you folks, either owns or holds forever wild easements on wildlands, totaling about 93,000 acres in New England and New York, 18,000 of which are in Vermont. And an initiative that launched in 2010 called Wildlands, Woodlands, Farmlands, and Communities is focused on thinking about New England at the region-wide landscape level, with the idea of protecting at least 10% of New England as wildlands, 60% as managed woodlands, where we'd be getting timber and firewood and other things, and 7% farmland. So as this vision makes clear, the choice is not between wildlands and managed forest, logging and ecological reserves, but it's a call for both. And turning to Vermont more specifically, this group undertook a census of wildlands in New England in 2023 and determined that Vermont had about 220,000 acres of wildlands, about 3.7% of the state. The bulk of which was, again, as Chair Sheldon recently mentioned, was in the National Forest. tens of thousands of acres also under private conservation. And it brings us to today's bill, H-276, to establish a network of wildlands and ecological reserves on state lands. This is a really exciting bill of great importance in, I think, complementing the wilderness on the national forest and private land, really the third piece of this network moving forward. Why are these wildlands so important? I know you've heard from some other folks, but let me just add my kind of thoughts. These are places where natural processes dominate and are important for many reasons. For protecting wild water quality and flood resilience, for sequestering carbon, for improving air quality, for biodiversity, and again, for these ecological reserves. And here again, they connect to some other Vermont policies that are already in place. Vermont conservation design, calling for 10% of Vermont to reach old forest or old growth conditions. Act 59, Vermont Climate Resilience and Biodiversity Protection Act, seeking to conserve 30% of Vermont by 2030 and 50% by 2050. And again, this is crucial. These reserves are going to be crucial to connectivity that both state agencies and nonprofits are working on as species are moving across the landscape in response to climate change. These lands are also really important for recreation and scenery, and the current recreation on these lands will not change, and also really important for solitude. Based on this bill, the only thing that really wouldn't happen that is currently happening, in my understanding, is timber harvesting, and that can happen on the other lands in the state. And I want to stress again, as I hope these points have indicated, wild lands are multiple use lands, and they are really part of a working landscape. We talk about the working landscape in Vermont all the time. And I think sometimes we think of wildlands as not being part of that, but they're doing a lot of work for us on some of those things I've mentioned: floods, water quality, carbon sequestration, et cetera. So based on the proposal in this bill, this would get Vermont to around 7%, again, getting us closer to that goal of a minimum of 10% or so. I did not compare notes with Chair Sheldon beforehand, but I just wanted to mention as well, for a sense of these forests, what they might look like, a trip across the lake to the Adirondacks, where roughly half the forest is protected as wildlands, some for now over 100 years, gives you a sense of what, with time, these places will look like. So in closing, I strongly support H-276. I think it's an important step to protect Vermont biodiversity, to further climate resilience, and to move the state forward toward its goal of 10% wildlands. And I'll just finish up with a quote from fellow New Englander Henry David Thoreau: "In wildness is the preservation of the world." Thank you very much. And I'd be happy if anybody has any questions, I'd be happy to do my best, but thank you.
Thank you for joining us. Do members have any questions? I would only add also that we don't have to go to the Adirondacks to get a sense of that feelings. Chris and I both are lucky to live in Addison County, where we have a fair amount of wilderness designated areas that are quite accessible. And you can really get a sense for how, what it means to be in an unmanaged forest. All right. Thank you again for joining us.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Right. And then we have our legislative counsel to walk us through the bill. Haven't seen enough of you, Ellen. It's nice to see you back.
It's been a long time since I've been in here. Ellen Tchaikovsky, Office of Legislative Counsel. So today I'm here on H-276 as introduced. This is an act relating to the designation of state wildlands. The first section is a short title, so it could be cited as the Vermont Climate Resilience and State Wildlands Act. And then section 2 is a set of findings. So on page 1, section 2, the General Assembly finds the planet is facing the consequences of climate action and the catastrophic loss of biodiversity both globally and locally. Intact and connected ecosystems reduce flood risks, mitigate drought, sequester and store carbon, and support Vermont's biodiversity and clean water. On to page 2. Vermont's most effective and efficient contribution to conserving biological diversity and maintaining a landscape resilient to climate change is to conserve an intact and connected landscape. The Department of Fish and Wildlife, working within the Agency of Natural Resources and with Vermont conservation organizations, has developed Vermont Conservation Design, a framework to sustain the state's ecologically functional landscape into the future. Vermont Conservation Design finds that historically, the vast majority of Vermont's landscape was old forest, and it is the original habitat condition for many species. The state's native flora and fauna that have been here prior to European settlement are adapted to this landscape of old, structurally complex forest, punctuated by natural disturbance gaps and occasional natural openings, such as wetlands and outcrops, rock outcrops. The complex physical structure of old forest creates diverse habitats, many of which are absent or much less abundant in younger forests. As a result of the persistent structural and vegetative complexity above ground and the diverse biome below ground, and associated complex biotic and abiotic relationships that develop over time, old forests also protect water quality, sequester and store carbon, provide opportunities for adaptation of species and community relationships to climate and other environmental changes. On to page 3. And set an ecological benchmark against which to measure active management of Vermont's forests. Although there are small patches of old forest scattered across the state, old forest is absent in Vermont as a functional component of the landscape. Allowing about 9% of Vermont's forests to become old forest will bring this missing component back to Vermont's landscape and offer confidence that species that benefit from or depend on this condition can persist. And in most forests, passive restoration will result in old forest conditions. Only approximately 4% of Vermont and 3% of New England are managed as ecological reserves as defined in 10 VSA Chapter 89 to assist with restoration of old forests. State lands provide only 2% of Vermont's average annual timber harvest volume. 90% of state lands are located in forested headwater settings, which are particularly susceptible to generating runoff during storm events, given their topography and geologic setting. On to page 4. 2023 Action Resolve number 59 called for prioritizing ecological reserve areas to protect highest priority natural communities and maintain or restore old forests. To meet the goals of 2023 Action Resolve number 59, the state of Vermont requires a statutory landscape designation to facilitate the establishment of ecological reserves on state lands. And just to remind you, Act 59 is the 30 by 30, 50 by 50 statute. So Section 3 starts the statutory language. It's creating a new chapter in Title 10, Chapter 90, State Wildlands. The first section, 2810, is a purpose section. The purpose of this chapter is to ensure, for the benefit of current and future generations of Vermonters, and for the entire community of life in the Green Mountain State, an enduring resource of publicly owned wildlands. Section 2811 sets out definitions for this chapter. Conversion has the same meaning as in the 30 by 30 statute, which means a fundamental change in natural ecosystem type or habitat, natural or undeveloped land cover type, or natural form and function of aquatic systems. So it's a fundamental change to the habitat type. The next definition is core area. It's an administrative land management designation used by the Agency of Natural Resources in long-range management plans for state lands. Highest priority natural communities and habitat features means conservation targets critical for an ecologically functional landscape that are identified in the Agency of Natural Resources Vermont Conservation Design. On to page 5. Land Management Classification 1.0, Highly Sensitive Management, means an administrative land management designation used by the Agency of Natural Resources in long-range management plans for state lands. And land management classification 4.0, intensive management, means an administrative land management designation used by the Vermont Agency of Natural Resources in long-range management plans for state lands. So some of this language in here is part of what ANR is already doing in their long-range management plans. Natural area has the same meaning in 2607, and 2607 is part of the Forest Parks and Recreation chapter, and these are areas that have, these are limited areas of land that have retained their wilderness character, although not necessarily completely natural and undisturbed, or have rare and vanishing species of plant or animal or similar features of interest that are worthy of preservation for the use of present and future residents of the state, and may include ecologically, geologic, scenic, and contemplative recreational areas on state lands. So there's a program part of FPR where these natural areas are designated and FPR oversees them. Definition number 7 is skiable line. Means the path taken by a skier or rider as they ski through trees or around obstacles. And then wildlands is defined. So wildlands means a land management designation within the category of ecological reserves as defined in 2802 of any size and current condition, permanently protected from conversion, and explicitly intended and managed to allow natural processes to prevail. So the next section, 2812, is setting up a designation for state wildlands. The following areas are designated as state wildlands, except as described in 2814. All state managed natural areas and core areas. These are areas as defined above that are already designated either by FPR or by ANR in their long-range management plans. All areas designated as land management classification 1.0 highly sensitive management as of January 1, 2025. On to page 6. All highest priority natural communities and habitat features identified by Vermont Conservation Design on state lands. And then there's a whole list of state parks.
You don't need to read them all.
Okay, okay. Yeah, so 4 through 24 are state-owned lands, specific state parks, state forests, and wildlife management areas. So this is establishing the list of what areas that the state already owns and manages as state wildlands. So on page 7, 2813 then sets out what the management for those lands are. So notwithstanding any other provision of law to the contrary, ANR shall manage state wildlands as follows. The area shall be permanently protected from conversion. ANR shall allow natural processes to prevail with minimal human interference. There shall be no vegetation management, including timber harvesting, pruning, cutting, herbicide application, salvage logging, or removal of diseased or infected trees. There shall be no alteration of surface waters, groundwater, wetland, or wetlands, including damming, draining, filling, diverting, or channelizing. This chapter shall not govern ANR's management of trail-based recreation, existing Class A and Class B roads as of January 1, 2025, designated according to the Department of Forest, Parks, and Recreation Policy number 13. In case you're curious, there are roads within the state-owned lands. So they have their own highway system. And policy number 13 states that Class A roads are paved or unpaved roads that are open year-round. And Class B roads are paved or unpaved roads that are generally open, but may be closed for certain parts of the year. So fairly intuitive there. It's the ones that are open year round and the ones that are only open, that are closed part of the year. Also, shall not govern the management of designated backcountry ski zones, as of January 1, 2025, where vegetation may be managed to maintain existing skiable lines. On to page 8. This shall not govern the management of hunting, fishing, foraging, gathering medicines, or practicing ceremony. And vegetation management in areas not listed in 2812 of this chapter or designated part of 2815 of this chapter. So areas that are not designated by this chapter as part of the wildlands program are not going to be affected by this policy. And nothing in this chapter shall prevent the state from authorizing measures required to respond to emergencies involving the health and safety of persons. Still on page 8, 2814 sets out the exclusions to this policy. So the following land are excluded from the wildlands designation in 2812 of this chapter. Lands designated in long-range management plan as of January 1, 2025 as land management classification 4.0 intensive management. Areas within a management unit for which a long-range management plan does not exist, or for which the long-range management plan predates ANR land management classification designations, but meets the definition and intent of land management classification 4.0 intensive management. And any areas where management as a wildland is legally precluded by deed or easement. And then finally on page 9, future designation of wildlands. Upon future acquisition of parcels that adjoin any areas listed in 2812, or that are separated from those areas only by a road or right-of-way, the Agency of Natural Resources shall manage those areas as wildlands unless, after an opportunity for public comment and public hearing, based on substantial evidence, the agency finds that doing so would not be consistent with the purpose of this chapter. And B, upon acquisition of future parcels that do not adjoin any areas listed in section 2812 of this chapter, or that are not separated from areas only by road or right-of-way, the Agency of Natural Resources shall inventory the qualities and characteristics of the acquired areas and shall manage these areas as wildlands if doing so would be consistent with the purpose of this chapter. The state shall not refuse to purchase or accept donated areas with a conservation easement, including forever wild easements, without just cause. And the effective date is July 1, 2025.
Thank you. Members have questions? Representative Pritchard.
So if some of these designated lands, for example, Levi Pond Wildlife Management Area, I'm very familiar with that area. It's in Groton. I've been deer hunting it for 15 years. That is managed for timber harvest. I can tell you it's been cut. That area has been cut. Does that mean that those practices will cease to exist on this?
So I don't know if any part of that currently has a long range management plan that might apply because there are those exclusions. So I don't know specifically. I think you may want to hear more about if it doesn't meet one of the exclusions, then yes, it would fall into the wildlands designation under this and not the.
I mean, I'm assuming there's probably only one Levi Pond Wildlife Management Area. The one I'm thinking of is in Groton. I don't know if that's the one. I can tell you that it has been managed for timber for a long time. And, I don't know if there's been a recent cutting there, but so if this was to happen and any harvesting at all of timber would cease to exist in this area here.
Yes, unless it meets one of these exclusions and has a long range management plan, which again, I'm not sure.
We would get into those details should we take the bill up. Other questions? Representative North.
Similar to that, if we were to stop managing some of these lands and allow them to become wildland, is there an additional risk of fire having not managed them? What are the potential secondary impacts of forest fires in these areas? Like, are there ski resorts that are uphill from them or anything that could have a secondary effect of a forest fire in these areas?
there are maps actually available of these lands, so we could, again, if we get into it, we can pull those up and I can share those with the committee. Was considered. All right, thank you, Ellen. Oh, Representative Bartholomew.
Trying to make sense of this designation, state wildland section that lists all these specific areas. But then at the beginning of that, 1, 2, 3 seem more general, whereas all these others are very specific. Why is it written that way?
To capture,
And where I'm going with that too is how did they decide which parks and areas are on the list?
well, I think it has to do with where there are significant natural communities. Right, so those are state parks that have, I don't know, actually, Zach, do you want to speak to that?
I'd be happy to, yeah. And great question about Levi Pond Wildlife Management Area. And I'd love to get back to you with exactly the current management regime, but that area is specifically managed actually to maintain or recover old growth or old forest characteristics. And yes, there are areas within Groton State Forest that are under active management for a variety of reasons. So it could be that those are adjacent areas to Levi Pond WMA itself. But let's dig into that.
Yeah, and I'm not sure how much that encompasses, because I know there was a lot of land gifted.
Yep.
And conserved there. I just don't know how big that Levi area is.
So to the other great question that was just asked about the areas that were listed. Vermont Conservation Design, and I should introduce myself. I'm Zach Porter. I'm Executive Director of Standing Trees, and we work on public land management in New England, based here in Montpelier. State and federal land management is our expertise. And the areas that were selected for the legislation reflect Vermont Conservation Design's focus on large landscapes. When it comes to protecting wildlands, bigger is generally better. And Vermont Conservation Design says very clearly that in managing for old forests, you want a minimum of around 1,000 acres in certain parts of Vermont and up, or 4,000 acres in other portions of Vermont and up, to be able to allow natural processes to function and to shape that future forest that you are trying to manage for and have all the diversity that you're looking for in that landscape. And so the areas that were selected in the legislation are all of about 1,000 acres and up in size. And again, for the purpose of ensuring that we're not talking about smaller parcels of state land, the focus here is on meeting that Vermont Conservation Design goal of managing for larger landscapes of future old forest. So that's how those lands were selected, in addition to calling out the very specific attributes like highest priority natural communities and habitat features, existing wildlands. So land management classification 1.0 are those lands that are today currently managed as wildlands by the state of Vermont. And land management classification 4.0 are those lands that are excluded from this bill. And those are your ski resorts, your campgrounds, your developed recreation sites, trailheads and whatnot. The bill purposefully excludes those types of lands from the designations, just to be clear about how that works.
I think also there's another part to answer your question, is which there's lands that are subject to different management by the agencies. And so I think because core areas and natural areas are managed differently. Natural areas are part of Forest Parks and Rec program, but core areas are part of ANR's long range management plan. So I think to capture them, they had to be listed separately.
One that comes to mind is like Windsor Grasslands, because that's in my district, but I'm assuming that it's too small or it's managed too much, that it wouldn't be in the list. Is that? Because there must be many others that are smaller.
That's right.
Did you say grasslands?
Windsor Grasslands.
Yeah.
Wildlife management area.
They manage as a grassland.
Well, if you don't keep cutting it, then all these trees grow everywhere. And then it becomes a forest and it's no longer grassland.
Right, well, but I'm just saying, by definition, it's already managed for a certain use. It wouldn't meet these characteristics. It wouldn't meet the character.
Yeah, okay. Yep.
And then Zach, if you could, can you speak to Representative North's question about fire?
Yes, I'd be happy to. So, for starters, the US Forest Service just did actually a nationwide threat assessment for wildfire. This was finished last year. And, our Green Mountain National Forest was identified as one of the, if not the forest with the lowest likelihood for wildfire activity. Wildfire is, of course, a natural part of shaping our ecosystems here in Vermont, but is an extraordinarily rare event, even today. And what we also know is that the older a forest becomes, actually, the more resilient it is to fire, and the more it naturally mitigates fire. Larger trees, larger bark, closed canopy, wetter forest floors and soils, all of those things contribute to the accumulation of down woody debris. In New England, that's the antidote. That's why we're called the asbestos forest here in the Northeast. So these forests are among the least fire prone in the nation, and of course we have wildlands of plenty in our region, as Professor Kleiza and Representative Sheldon were mentioning earlier, where fire has never been a problem. And so again, it's another good reason why larger areas, though, are ideal, because it allows these processes to play out and shape a healthy ecosystem. And again, the bill does not prohibit, if God forbid there were, structures, lives, endangered. This bill does nothing to prevent the state of Vermont from doing what's necessary to protect property, life, and that's a critical part of course, the management of state lands like this too.
Further questions? All right, great. Thanks, Ellen.
Thank you.
All right, members, we are, our next item is not till 3:00, so we have a little. Oh,
Just for the
Oh.
room that I was just writing.
sure. Rob Leclerc, are you?
Oh, he didn't interrupt with
Oh,
the weighted room.
okay. Do you want to let him in? Is he still our only guest for this segment?
Yes.
I don't see him up there. Rob Leclerc, are you available by Zoom? Not showing up there. You have to say yes or something.
Let's do that.
He's in on your room, but not ours.
That's all that I know as well.
Thank you for bringing that picture. Cool. Yeah, that's. It's,
Let's take a break. Oh, no, wait, here he is. That's Rep Leclerc. Representative Leclerc, can you hear us?
big form.
Former. Rob Leclerc, can you hear us? Can you try unmuting him?
It's fine. Can't hear me.
It's muted. No. Rob Leclerc, can you unmute, please? It's not really with us till 3.
We just signed on early.
All right, let's take a 7-minute break and see if he'll be available at 1:45.